Hello everyone, it is Friday, and that means it is time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at one of the more powerful effects in Magic, and that is discard effects, discard spells. Causing your opponent to discard cards is a great way of disrupting their strategy and slowing them down so that you can take over the game. Discard effects have always existed in Magic, and Wizards make sure that basically every standard format has discard effects, as these sorts of spells help keep ridiculous combo decks in check. In this video, we're going to look at the top 10 discard spells that made the biggest impact on Magic's history. Before we do that, let me lay out the criteria for what I considered a discard effect. Cards eligible for this list were any cards that made your opponent lose a card from their hand. This meant that symmetrical discard effects are eligible, as are effects that don't technically make your opponent discard a card, but instead make them exile a card from their hand. It also includes cards that only cause the discard of specific card types. Before we get to the list, a quick reminder on how I score these videos. Pro Tour Top 8s and Legacy and Vintage Championships get 2 points, and Grand Prix Top 8s get 1 point. Before we get to number 10, I do want to include an honorable mention, as it is remembered by many as one of the most busted discard spells ever. This is a card that we all think of when we think of powerful discard spells, but because it was quickly restricted and banned in multiple formats, it never got to live up to its full potential, and that is Mind Twist. This card has existed as long as Magic has, and it is stupid powerful. The card had to be banned because basically whoever cast Mind Twist first was just going to win the game, and that made things a little bit too imbalanced. So after appearances at the first two Worlds in 1994 and 1995, the card never saw play again. Now let's move to number 10. At number 10, we start with a Planeswalker, Liliana Vess. This is the very first Liliana Planeswalker, and was one of the first 5 Planeswalkers produced in general, having been introduced in Lorwyn. Like most Lilianas, this one likes to go after your opponent's hand. She also provides a tutor effect and an ultimate that can just end games, and it happens to synergize quite well with making your opponent discard cards. Liliana gets an extra boost on this list because she's been reprinted numerous times, but the fact that she was in standard playable in multiple formats indicates how good of a card she is. Her first time through Standard, she managed some impressive showings. This included 6 top 8s at Worlds that year, appearing in Elves, Doran Siege Tower decks, and Black-Red mid-range. She eventually also became a mainstay in Blue-Black Control and Fairies decks in that Standard. After reprints in Magic 2010 and 2011, she didn't see another reprint until Magic 2015, where she once again showed up in Tier 1 decks. This time around, though, it was Abzan. Liliana also managed a couple of Grand Prix Top 8s in Extended, one in Fairies and the other in a deck that is a personal favorite of mine, Deathcloud. Wizards does not seem super keen on reprinting Planeswalkers anymore, at least outside of Masters or From the Vault, so it seems unlikely that she finds her way into another Standard format, but for now, she's number 10 on this list, though I will say Thought-Knot Seer is right behind her with 48 points, and it seems super likely that Thought-Knot Seer will eventually push her off of this list. At number 9, we have one of Magic's most iconic discard spells, Hymn to Turok. 2 mana to make an opponent discard 2 cards is already going to be a 2-for-1, but this is even better than that because it makes your opponent choose what to discard randomly. Sometimes you can cast this and hit 2 lands and your opponent fails to ever draw another one. Other times you take away their only threats or interactive spells. No matter what, casting Hymn to Turok is a brutal thing to do on turn 2. And maybe even on turn 1 with Dark Ritual. Hymn was a dominant card in the early days of Magic, managing 8 Worlds or Pro Tour Top 8s from 1995 to 1996. Hymn was just good in any black deck. Whether it was a control deck that wanted to 2-for-1 the opponent to win the long game, or an aggressive deck that wanted to disrupt their opponent's plans for dealing with their threats. Its ubiquity eventually led to it being restricted in Standard. After Extended was created, it saw a bit of play there too, with all 3 of its Pro Tour Top 8s coming in 1997 in Necropotence decks. Then, for a while, competitive Magic players were free from being concerned about having Hymn to Turok ruin their plans, but in 2005 it found its way into Legacy, and it hasn't really stopped seeing play there ever since. It has become a mainstay in black aggro decks, often called Suicide Black, because so many of its efficiently costed creatures also did damage to you. More recently, though, it has been played in Legacy, Jund, and Junk, and most recently, it's a staple in shardless bug decks in the format. It will continue to see play in Legacy and continue to move up this list. At number 8, we have a creature that lets you go after your opponent's hand when it comes into play, and that is Sin Collector. The Collector has a powerful effect against control decks, not only getting rid of the best instant or sorcery in their hand, but also allowing you to get important information about your opponent's hand. Control decks themselves played it too, as it was a way to disrupt combo decks, and even taking removal away from more aggressive decks isn't a bad idea. At Pro Tour Dragon's Maze in 2013, which was a block Pro Tour, the Collector was powerful enough to find 4 top 8s. In Standard, it saw a solid amount of play too, in Aristocrats, Reanimator, Junk, Esper Control, and eventually, its main home there, Orzhov Control. It also saw play in Modern, where it was a good utility creature for Birthing Pod decks. It was a good creature to tutor up against opponents with lots of instants and sorceries. And, like other cards that were common in Birthing Pod decks, Sin Collector has since transitioned into Collected Company and Court of Calling decks, where it is still seeing play today. At number 7, we have a card that does a whole lot more than just make the opponent discard cards, and that is Kolaghan's Command. Easily the best of the command cycle from Dragons of Tarkir, Kolaghan's Command basically always guarantees you a 2-for-1 for only 3 mana. You can use it to make your opponent discard to get a creature back from your graveyard, to destroy an artifact, or to do 2 damage to something. Basically, no matter which 2 you choose, you are getting a 2-for-1. The options on modal cards like this are very powerful too, as they can be good against all decks because of their flexibility. Its power was realized very quickly, with it showing up all over in Standard in both aggro and control decks. This included Mardu and Rakdos aggro, Jeskai midrange, and Grixis control. However, while it was certainly played with some regularity, it wasn't exactly an all-star in Standard. Instead, it has become an important card in Modern. It has seen play there in Grixis Control and Jund, but both of these decks have seen a lot less play recently. Today, it sees the most play in both Grixis and Naya Death's Shadow decks, and it will continue to see play there. It even has seen a little bit of play in Legacy Delver decks. It figures to continue to move up this list and maybe pass some of the less played cards above it. At number 6, we have another discard spell with an old border, and that is Cabal Therapy. At first glance, a card that doesn't actually make your opponent discard something unless you name the right card doesn't seem great. But this card really shines in decks that have creatures who can keep coming back from the graveyard. The first casting helps you know what to name, and when you flash it back, sacrificing, say, Icarid, you get to hit a card or 2. What's more is, in a world where Tier 1 decks are well defined, you can actually name the right card with the first time you cast Cabal Therapy too, reasonably often, assuming you know what deck your opponent is playing. Despite all its success, it wasn't a card that saw any play in block, and it saw very little in play in Standard, though it did manage 2 World's Top 8s in that format in 2003, both in decks that could bring creatures back from the graveyard with ease. It first started to see regular play in Extended, putting up dominant showing at Pro Tour Houston in 2002, where it managed a whopping 6 top 8s. This included graveyard-heavy decks like Reanimator, Dredge, and Icarid, but it also managed to find its way into mono-black aggro decks, which were willing to give up one of their weaker creatures to take a removal spell or board sweeper out of the opponent's hand. It also found its way into Legacy, where it continues to see play. Its most common home is in all the variants of Delver, but it sees play in Ad Nauseam, Dredge, and several other decks too. This is a discard spell so good it even sees play in vintage versions of Dredge. Therapy is not the kind of card that will be fading from this list anytime soon. At number 5, we have the second Liliana Planeswalker to make the list, one that many consider one of the most powerful Planeswalkers ever, and that is Liliana of the Veil. Liliana is incredibly powerful in large part because she's so cheap. 3 mana for a Planeswalker frequently results in that Planeswalker being quite strong, especially if they have some at least solid abilities, but Liliana does far better than that. Decks that run her love her because she can come down on turn 3 and make an opponent lose a creature, and then she can slowly pick apart people's hands. Her ultimate is reasonable, but usually one alternates between her +1 and -2, and that is enough to get you to victory if you manage to play her on turn 3. When she was in Standard, she appeared in a wide variety of decks, including not only control decks, where you would probably expect to see it, but also in some more aggressive builds, like mono-black Infect and blue-black Zombies. Turns out, at 3 mana, a lot of decks are pretty happy tapping out for Liliana. If you are curving out with an aggro deck like Infect or Zombie and playing a 1 and a 2-drop, and then you play Liliana to make them sacrifice their only blocker, you're getting in for a lot of damage. Liliana has actually been most impressive in Modern, where she is one of the essential cards in the powerful Jund decks of the Modern format. More recently, she's found her way into Death's Shadow Zoo decks. It's hard to imagine a Modern format where there isn't a deck playing her. She also sees play in Legacy Jund and Shardless Bug, and is continuing to put up points in that format as well. At number 4, we have a discard spell that has served as a staple in multiple formats, and that is Inquisition of Kozilek. Inquisition is an excellent card because it disrupts the opponent's hand so efficiently, while also giving you some information about their hand. In fact, as you will see, all 4 of the cards to make the top of this list allow you to look at your opponent's hand, and that is not a coincidence. Getting to be able to take an opponent's card and also gain some information is powerful. Sure, Inquisition can only hit cards with converted mana cost 3 or less, but in most constructed formats, if you are missing with your Inquisition, you're in pretty good shape because your opponent isn't going to be able to do anything in the early game anyway. There are tons of great hands that can get completely wrecked by Inquisition of Kozilek. In Standard, it saw a lot of play, primarily in control decks like Blue-Black Control, Tezzeret Control, and Bug Control, but it also found its way into Vampire aggro decks and the post-ban versions of Caw-Blade. While Extended didn't last long after it was printed, for the brief time it did exist, it managed to put up 4 Grand Prix top 8s, all in Fairy decks. It didn't skip a beat though when Extended was phased out and Modern was created, as it has become an important card in that format as well. After Modern was first created, it was one of the more iconic cards in Jund. By 2015 it began to see play in the Abzan decks that were dominant that year. Most recently, like a lot of the cards in this list, it has started to be played in Death Shadow decks, where gaining additional information is incredibly valuable, as the deck is capable of just ending the game in a single swing, but if your opponent has removal in their hand, you don't want to try to go for that combo, and the good news is, you can use Inquisition to get rid of most removal too. It sees play in another deck that thrives on information in Modern right now, and that is Lantern Control, which is a prison deck which has the primary goal of making it so you only draw cards that are useless against them. Even Legacy decks are interested in turn 1 disruption that is this powerful, where it has appeared in various Delver and 4-color control builds. Like all of the cards on this list, except Liliana Vess and the number 3 card we're about to talk about, Inquisition of Kozilek is still seeing play, and figures to continue to cement its position as one of the best discard spells in the history of Magic. At number 3, we have the newest card to make this list, and that is Transgress the Mind. Instead of going after cheaper cards like Inquisition of Kozilek does, Transgress goes after more expensive cards. Transgress saw a ton of play though, primarily because the standard it was a great part of was loaded with decks running a lot of cards with higher converted mana costs. It also didn't hurt that it exiled cards, as there were a few cards in the format, mostly Eldrazi, that could interact with cards that had been exiled. It saw play in the main boards or sideboards of basically every black deck that was played while it was in Standard. In the early days, this meant Abzan decks, and then it shifted to Grixis and Orzhov Control. Golgari Delirium was one of the decks it saw the most play in, though, and this was followed by Golgari Constrictor, and most recently, Golgari Energy decks before Transgress rotated out. While it was a heavily played card in Standard, it hasn't found a home since it rotated, and it probably won't. I mean, the strength of the other discard spells on this list is just higher than Transgress the Mind, and while it may sit at number 3 now, it is pretty much a guarantee that some of the cards behind it that are still seeing play will pass it at some point. At number 2, we have a card that has been reprinted a ton of times and always sees play in Standard when it does, and that is Duress. This card efficiently disrupts your opponent while granting you information. Sure, it can't hit creatures, but Duress is going to hit a card the majority of the time in most formats against most decks, and anytime it has been in Standard, it has been a great sideboard card. It has been reprinted in 8 Standard legal sets, really setting it up to put up an insane number of points, but it isn't like Duress has only been played in Standard. But you can bet anytime it has been legal in Standard, like right now, and black decks have existed, it has been in the sideboards and main boards of those decks. While certainly less played in other formats, its next most successful format was Extended, where it similarly found its way into most black decks. It even sees some play in Vintage. Most recently, it has been seeing play in Standard after another reprint. Modern still sees play there, and to a lesser degree in Legacy. Since it's legal in Standard right now, thanks to another reprint, you can bet it will continue to pile up points. But the question is, will it ever catch the number 1 discard spell on this list? At number 1, we have the card that is perhaps the most powerful discard spell ever, a card that has the highest score of all the sorceries in Magic. That's another top 10 list I did showing you just how strong it is, and a card that has the highest score of any card across more than 90 MTG top 10s, and that is Thoughtseize. It has over 100 points on Duress, so it probably doesn't need to sweat the fact that Duress is back in Standard right now, especially because Thoughtseize is so heavily played in non-rotating formats. So what makes Thoughtseize the best? Well, the fact that for a single mana, you get to take away any one of your opponent's best cards, assuming it's not a land. Sure, you lose 2 life, but that's well worth it. Cards like Inquisition of Kozilek, Transgress the Mind, and Duress can't just hit anything. Thoughtseize can. You gain an immense amount of information and make your opponent's game go a lot less smoothly. Unlike Duress, Thoughtseize is almost always in the main board too. Like Duress though, going through and talking about every deck that ever ran the card would be incredibly long and boring, but let's do a few of its greatest hits. It was dominant in Fairies decks in Extended, Jund decks in Modern, and more recently in Death Shadow, and in various Delver and Control decks in Legacy. It isn't falling out of the top spot on this list anytime soon. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.